Welcome back to Intersections, where we explore the intersections of faith, life, and culture. This is part 2 in a series in which I'm talking about faith and prosperity. In particular, I'm looking at a sermon preached by Bishop Wayne Michael on the topic of whether or not Jesus was rich or poor. Part 1, you can find it here on my channel. You can find it on the podcast. This is part 2, which is the second part of this sermon. We'll be watching some clips of the sermon, and I'll be offering my commentary and debunk some things as well as affirm some things that this bishop says about the financial statement of Jesus. Stay tuned.
Before I even get into Jesus, can I tell you the story of the Good Samaritan? That be cool? Who was the Good Samaritan? This was the brother who was on his way to Jerusalem and noted a man who had been robbed, stripped, beaten, and left for half dead, a man that needed his help. The Good Samaritan went down to the man, laid hands on him and said, "Be well, my brother, be whole. God loves you. See you next time." No, he didn't do that. He went down, picked up the man, put the man on his own transportation, took him to an inn, and paid the innkeeper for all of his medical expenses, and said, "If this is not enough, when I come back, I will settle the bill." Do you notice that the story assumes that good people are in a position financially to help the most vulnerable people in society? There's an assumption that actually, if you are a good person, you are going to be in a position to not only say comforting words, but to offer practical assistance. And that assumption runs current through every passage that says how God will bless those that remember the poor, and how he will, that he's for those people who consider the poor. Well, you can't consider the poor unless you are in a financial position to offer practical assistance. So there's a success assumption running current through the Bible. I'm going to give you another one before I get to Jesus, because context is everything, right? Introduction is context, and context is everything. Proverbs 13:22, I believe, says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Now, hold on a second. A good man. Let's all say a good man. Right. That means a upright, honorable, noble, virtuous, pious man will leave an inheritance for his grandchildren, which means that just enough is not enough for a good man.
All right, so he begins this part of his message by arguing that good people are wealthy people, in essence. And you're going to see a couple of clips in which he does this. And he starts off with the story of the Good Samaritan. So first of all, I agree with him in terms of if you have means, you should use those means to help others, and that you should pursue means and wealth. One of the reasons you should pursue it is so that you can help others. I mean, I know in my own life and in our marriage, my wife and I, this is something we've always striven to do, is to, whatever we did in life, whatever it was we were doing to earn money or to make money, part of the reason we wanted to do it was we wanted to be able to help others, friends and family, and even strangers as they needed it. But he takes the story of the Good Samaritan and he basically emphasizes that the Good Samaritan is a good person because he had the means to take care of the victim in that story. And you know the story, you've probably heard it before. The Good Samaritan finds this man who's beat up on the side of the road. He picks him up. He takes him to a place to stay. He covers his costs there. He tells the person taking care of him, whatever it costs you to take care of him above and beyond what I've given you, I'll give you more when I return. So, it is a story of a good Samaritan. But what makes the Samaritan good? And this is very important because it's kind of the central message of that parable. What makes the Samaritan good in the story is not his wealth. It's not his ability to take care of the other person, but it was his compassion and his righteousness. It was his love of neighbor that made him the good Samaritan in the parable. I mean, in all actuality, the other men in the story, the Levite and the priest, who passed by the man and did not help him, they also had money, but that didn't make them good. You see, so it's not the means that make the Samaritan good. And he, in this message, I feel like is sort of pushing that narrative that what makes the Good Samaritan good is that the Good Samaritan had the means to take care of the man on the side of the road. Well, again, so did everybody else that passed him. What made the Good Samaritan good was not the means that he had, but was that he used those means, that he took the time to love his neighbor and used those means to help this poor man out who had been beaten and left for dead. Now, this kind of compassion, this kind of love of neighbor is something that's emphasized throughout the teachings of Jesus and is something that is practiced in the New Testament. And when it's practiced, the earliest example of it is in the book of Acts chapter 2, as far as it being practiced by the early church. And our brother here, the bishop preaching this sermon, obviously is a capitalist, an entrepreneur. Nothing wrong with that. Just pointing it out that he's coming at this from a very capitalistic sort of perspective and ideology. But when you look at the way that this was actually practiced in the New Testament early on, it looked a whole lot more like communism than it did capitalism. And this is not a commentary on any sort of political or economic system. I'm only pointing out the difference in the mindset because, of course, this is thousands of years ago. Capitalism and communism, in terms of what they are today, didn't really exist. The systems, or at least the primitive versions of those systems, were at play. But it didn't exist as we know it now. However, our brother here is really reading this from a capitalistic approach, and the culture of that time period, the time period of Jesus, in which he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, was still a culture that was very communal and community-based. And in Acts chapter 2, verse 44, it says, all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions and gave it to anyone who had need. So we have an example of what this actually looks like being practiced by the early church, and it does not look like people going out and making as much money for themselves so that they could share a little bit here and there with other people. What it looks more like is people actually abandoning their pursuit of wealth and their withholding of wealth and their saving of wealth and then sharing it among everyone. Now, I'm not saying that's something that should necessarily be a practical way of doing things today, although there are Christian communities who do practice it in this way, and it's very beautiful. At the same time, I think that it's okay to practice your giving and your charity in other ways that may seem more private and capitalist in nature. The key is the position of the heart and how we're wanting to share that wealth and how honest we are we're being with God and with others about how we can help and what we can do to help. He also uses Proverbs 13:22 as a supporting verse about good men. He's really emphasizing this wealth equals good thing. He uses this verse, Proverbs 13:22, about a good man leaves an inheritance for his generation and the generation after that. What he omits here, now he does read the second part of this verse later, but right now, when he's making this point, he doesn't read the second part of that proverb. And every proverb has sort of a positive and a negative statement in it, okay? So when you read a proverb, there's this good thing, and then there's this thing that's bad, or there's this bad thing, and then there's this description of things that are good. So in Proverbs 13:22, it says, a good man stores up his wealth as an inheritance for generation and generation. But the second part of that verse says that the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. The wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. So it's comparing and contrasting who gets the wealth of a good man versus who gets the wealth of a bad man. It's not saying that the wealth is what makes one person good and one person bad. In the proverb, there's actually a good person and a sinful person. Both of them happen to be wealthy people, but the wealth of the good man is reserved for his family, whereas the wealth of the sinner only lasts one generation, and then it is redistributed to those who need it most. So the goodness of the person is not in the amount of health that wealth that they have. It's rather in how they, whether they're good or bad is determined by how that generational wealth is then passed down. That's what that proverb is saying. Take it for what it's worth. A wicked man's wealth dies with him, basically. It doesn't make it past one generation. It is liquidated, and it's given back to the people who need it. So wealth does not necessarily equal good, and I think that's a very important concept for us to understand when we explore the intersections of faith and prosperity. There are a lot of good people who aren't wealthy. There are good people who are wealthy. There's a ton of us good people somewhere in the middle of all of that. So good does not equal wealthy. I think that's just very important. Now, he does make a statement here, drawing from that proverb, that I do think is a wise statement, at least, that just enough is not enough for a good man. And I do think that is important. I think that if you are, especially in today's financial climate, if you are going to be a good steward of the means that God has given you, especially if you have people who you are responsible for taking care of, whether it's your family members, your children, whatever, you need to be a good steward of that. And just enough is not enough, unfortunately. You have to figure out a way to put some aside and to save some and to build some margins for yourself. It's wise to steward your finances in such a way that you have margins in life. I lived like when I was younger, I lived a lot of my youth living paycheck to paycheck by choice, because I didn't really have an earning problem. I had a spending problem, and I didn't really know how to balance that out. And I also didn't understand how important it was to build margins into your budget. If you're just like I did when I was young, just spending off of your bank account and checking your app, and that's how you're budgeting, that's not wise. So I do think you do need to have money for emergencies. You do need to have margins in life. I do think that's important. Okay, before we jump back into any clips, I'm just going to kind of speed things up here. I encourage you to go watch the sermon and, of course, form your own opinions. But for the next 10 to 15 minutes after this, he's just going to really preach about his belief that wealth is a moral obligation. He believes that pursuing wealth is something that wise people should do, and not only wise people, but that moral people should do. He really does emphasize that. He does go on, I will give him some props, he does go on and mention the second half of that Proverbs 13:22 verse, but he still uses it as an individual clause. He doesn't put it in conversation with the first part of that verse, and he just argues that good people should have all the wealth and not the bad people. So he's like, well, it does say that the wealth of the bad person will be given to the good, but then he's arguing that's because the good people should have the wealth and not the bad. It doesn't seem to me that that's what that proverb is emphasizing. It doesn't seem like that is what the writer of that proverb was trying to get at. However, I do understand where he's coming from. I see how you could do that, but when you put those clauses in conversation with one another, wealth is not the issue of goodness. Rather, it is just saying that you can have you can have wealthy rich people who are good, wealthy people who are good. You could have wealthy people who are sinful. At the end of the day, the wealth of the good will be preserved for generations, and the wealth of the wicked will be redistributed. So take that for what it's worth. But we're going to jump back in now. This is the next video. He's going to talk now about Jesus, and this is what I really wanted to get to for the rest of this sermon. He's just going to try to prove that Jesus was rich and not poor.
So let's look at the life of Christ. Can we do that? Okay. So let's start with the family into which he was born. Correct? You got Mary, you got Joseph. We know from at least two Gospels that they are direct descendants of King David. So they are actually members of a royal family. I mean, you can actually track name by name. You got it in Matthew, you got it in Luke, that both Mary and Joseph are descendants of King David. They are members of a royal family.
Okay, so here's the deal. A few months ago, I downloaded an app, a genealogy app, and I have searched genealogies on both my mother and my father's side somewhat over the course of my lifetime. someone had done a lot of work on my mother's side of the family who settled in rural North Carolina, the Montgomery County area of North Carolina, and were basically blue-collar workers, loggers, got by the skin of their teeth, generationally deep. And that's just the kind of, that is my ancestry and what influenced, my upbringing and my family of origin the most was that ancestry, because we grew up near where they were from. We grew up in the same town, or I grew up in the same town. That's where my parents raised me at. However, in this genealogy, to my surprise, you go back far enough, several generations, you'll discover we have some royal blood. We've got some like dukes of this place and, all this kind of stuff. Y'all, it didn't help us a bit. And so I just think it's funny that he would use this argument that Mary and Joseph were part of a royal family. Now, the genealogies in Matthew and Luke definitely link Mary and Joseph to the house of David, making them lineage from royalty. However, if you do some textual criticism, you might discover that something else is at work there. We might not be getting a literal generation for generation outline or factual outline of where Jesus's lineage hails from. Put that aside. Let's just say, for instance, it is factual, 100%. They are actually blood DNA lineage from the throne of David. It means nothing now. That does not mean they're wealthy. The monarchy had fallen centuries before. By this point, we're dealing with Herod and his throne and Herod's temple. Like, David and his legacy are long gone. Nobody is reaping any financial benefit from being in the line of David at this point. And most of us, if we were to trace our lineage back, we're probably going to find someone who's wealthy or someone who's royal, but it doesn't mean that it has any effect on us. So I just kind of eye roll at this point. I don't know why he's using that. It's a terrible example because, again, take the textual criticism aside, it just doesn't make any sense that this many generations that would have any bearing on the wealth of Jesus or of his family. But let's continue.
But Joseph was a carpenter, correct? Okay. So when we think of a carpenter, you know what we think of? We think of tables, chairs, and shelves. We think of the handyman that's going to fix something that's broken in your house. But in the ancient world and in the New Testament times, the entire infrastructure of society relied on the skill of a carpenter. There were no houses without carpenters. There were no farming tools without carpenters. And there were no fishing tools, including boats, without carpenters. Nothing, the entire infrastructure relied on the profession of a carpenter. So far from this being a blue-collar, middle-income trade, this is one of the highest-paying professions in the ancient world because everything relies on it. So Joseph is in he's in one of the highest-paying professions and growth industries of the ancient world, but he's not just a carpenter. The Bible says of Jesus, is not this the carpenter's son? Which means, now come on, it's different to being a carpenter and being the carpenter. Because when people say you are the carpenter, it means that you are the one above all the others that are calling themselves carpenters. You are the carpenter. There's a difference between being a singer and being the singer. Joseph is the carpenter. And the only reason he is going to Bethlehem is to be taxed. And you don't get taxed unless you have some money.
Wrong.
wish I had some help in here.
Not quite accurate for this time period. Poor people were taxed.
He said, oh, but
crazy.
Jesus is born in a stable. Well, let me tell you why.
Because all the rich people got the other rooms
The
first.
Bible doesn't say he was born in a stable because Joseph couldn't afford an inn. It says because there was no room in the inn. Well, how do you know there's no room in the inn, Joseph? Because I have been trying all the inns in Bethlehem and they are fully booked. Which means...
Okay, so let's just work backwards from this because there are so many assumptions in what he is saying. I mean, just massive amounts of assumptions. Okay, first of all, people without money were still taxed. That's kind of how the Roman Empire worked, and it's how the religious elites among the Jewish religion, it's how they stayed in power. They enforced it, and they benefited from overtaxing. They actually had a system by which they would tax the poor by foreclosing on their property and then have them work as slaves to work their taxes off. And it was a way of basically generating free labor for the Roman Empire. So, yeah, so that's, I mean, it's a reach. And the reason why there was no room in the inn, I mean, Joseph may have just been late. I mean, he came from a long distance. But also because most of the time in this culture, motels weren't like, it wasn't like you go to the Motel 6 or the Holiday Inn or whatever. It wasn't like, hotels and motels were like people with larger homes opening up parts of their home for people to come to. All right, it wasn't the capitalistic idea that we have today. So the fact that there wasn't anywhere to stay actually shows not that Joseph like had money, just couldn't find a place. It shows that Joseph didn't have the kind of social equity that other people had to actually get into one of those rooms. So because those were mostly held for like cronies and friends and family members of the same social status and whatnot. So a lot of assumptions there. You know, there's a lot we don't know. Maybe Joseph had a ton of money and just couldn't get a place. But there's just so many assumptions made. It's also a huge assumption. I want to jump on this real quick. He makes a really big deal out of Joseph being the carpenter. The definite article there, the word "the" that's included there. Who knows why it was put in? It doesn't necessarily mean that he's the head carpenter. And in this word "carpenter," he is right. In terms of like carpenters aren't what we think of as a carpenter today. The Greek word here could be translated any sort of like craftsman, tradesperson that builds things. It could be a stone worker or a metal worker or a woodworker, any of those. But, he's saying that a carpenter makes everything from fishing gear. It's not true because you got metal workers that are going to make fishing gear and houses back then. He talks about building houses. Houses were still made of mud and clay. I've been to Israel, and a lot of those houses were made of mud, clay, and stone during the time of Jesus. So it's not the same thing. There's no evidence to say Joseph was like this wealthy general contractor. And even if he was like the carpenter, he's in Nazareth, y'all. Nazareth was a very, very small area at this time. Some people estimate the population as high as 2,000, but most scholars believe the population was probably as low as like 300 to 500 of Nazareth. So he's not out there running some big business. The other thing is the people of Nazareth were very poor. And they were also considered to be very uneducated. There were actually jokes told in the southern part of Israel about the northern part where Galilee and Nazareth is because of the accent that people talked with and the levels of illiteracy that they had in that area. So in Jesus' time period, multiple mediums were part of the infrastructure, not just carpenters. Homes could have been made by bricklayers, stone layers, mud workers. So yeah, and a resident of Nazareth is not going to be rolling in a ton of money as a carpenter. Galileans were despised, and jobs like this were considered for lower income people. They were family trades, and they were reserved for people. The same thing with the fishermen; they were reserved for people who couldn't really get out of the that business because they didn't have the intellect or the education to move into something else. And that's the way it worked. If you weren't good enough to be a rabbi, or if you weren't smart enough to get to the next levels in school, at some point you would just turn around and go home and work for your father in the family trade. That's probably what Joseph did. Jesus was probably part of that family trade at some point. These jobs would have been for low-income people in a low-income area. So a lot of assumptions made about Joseph there. I appreciate him wanting to give Joseph some clout, but there is just no evidence to support that whatsoever, and it's just a lot of assumptions.
But who are these wise men? These wise men have come from the east. And I know we think that there were 3 wise men. The Bible doesn't say there were 3 wise men. It talks about 3 categories of gift: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It simply says there were wise men who came from the east. This is called a diplomatic delegation. And we know they were a diplomatic delegation representing real kings in the east, because they were given an audience with King Herod en route to Jesus. Now, regular guys can't get audiences with kings. But a diplomatic delegation representing actual kings would get an audience with the king of a particular region. So they come to Herod and they say, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him," which means we have come to honor him, which if you understand the ancient world, the size of your gift is the honor that you have for the king. So when they said they come to honor, it wasn't simply a matter of we've come to say, "Oh, Jesus, we believe in you. You're the one." No, we're going to give you the honor from our kings to your king. And so, according to the historians, they were not carrying a little bag of gold, a bag of frankincense, and a bag of myrrh. They were not 3 old men hobbling through the town, with little bags. Where is he? Where is he? That is, where? Because King Herod would have said, "He's that way. Just keep going, guys. Just keep it going. He's that way." But according to the historians, when kings sought to honor another king, what they were sending was caravans of wealth. So that historically, this diplomatic delegation were moving with caravans of gold, caravans of frankincense, and caravans of myrrh. This is why King Herod could not sleep after meeting them and plotted to commit murder of all of the children below 2 years old in Bethlehem. Not because Herod was simply a psycho, but because the might of the delegation was evidence to Herod that the other kings recognized another king inside of his kingdom. So what these wise men had brought was wagons of gold, wagons of frankincense, wagons of myrrh, and the Bible doesn't say they gave them to Mary and Joseph. It says they presented to Jesus, who's a little baby, their gifts, which made Mary and Joseph trustees or custodians of a fortune that was deposited into the life of Christ as a baby. I am convinced that every expense he would ever need throughout his entire ministry was met in one move.
All right, so he's on to something here, okay? He's right about a lot of things here. He is right about the fact that this isn't just 3 wise men visiting. I know a lot of times that's the way it's portrayed in Christmas plays and in Christmas pageants, but that is not what happened. These would have been caravans, and it would have looked like a diplomatic group coming in. These were wise men. They were very wealthy. They probably had some political power in the East. They were definitely known, or at least notable to Herod, for them to get an audience with him. And even if it was just 3, individuals who weren't of some sort of diplomatic mission, or weren't from like royalty or considered, to have clout from their area, even if it was just 3 regular guys bringing a little bit of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, there would have been more than 3 people traveling. There would have still been a caravan. To make that journey, it would have taken a group of people. So he's right about that, right on. And this is something that's very cool and something I've given a lot of thought to over the years, because we actually don't know how much gold, frankincense, and myrrh Jesus got. It doesn't say it was wagons. I don't know that it was. It could have been. It still could have been small portions of it. They came obviously with a group of people, and they were notable. Even if it was a small amount, though, it was probably a significant amount of wealth for a family like Mary and Joseph. And some people believe that this is how they were able to afford their trip into Egypt. Because, Joseph takes Mary and Jesus into Egypt right after the wise men's gift, because Herod starts to murder children trying to find the Christ child, and they flee to Egypt. And so there are some scholars that believe that the gold, frankincense, and myrrh was basically the wealth they used to sustain them in a foreign land, because it would have been quite expensive for someone to leave the area of Israel and go live in Egypt for several years, which is most likely what Mary and Joseph did. So, yeah, this is a cool theory. We really don't know how much, and maybe some of that wealth did follow Jesus. Again, I'm not here to argue that Jesus was poor necessarily. I think that the crux of the matter is not in whether Jesus was rich or poor, but rather what Jesus taught us about having the right attitudes toward wealth and having the right heart towards wealth. So, yeah, this is a cool little theory. Yeah, wise men, they didn't just bring little, like we see in the Christmas play, they didn't bring little gifts and give to Jesus. It was very possible they brought a significant amount with them, and they definitely were a wealthy group of individuals who came in on a caravan.
So we don't hear much about Jesus between 12 and 30. Around 30, he's baptized by John, goes into the wilderness, and starts his ministry. But according to John's gospel, the first miracle Jesus ever did was to turn water into wine. Fair? What was it? His? What was it? His? Which means that before that, we've never seen him work a miracle. We have no idea that he even works miracles. So when they had run out of wine at the wedding and came to Mary and said, Mary, we've run out of wine. They've never seen Mary work a miracle. They're not asking a supernatural question, because he's never worked a miracle before. They're saying, Mary, why tell Mary? Because Mary's the rich family that's there. If you run out of something at the party, who are you telling? You're telling the people who have the means to solve the problem.
Or the servants.
Mary says, why don't tell me, tell Jesus. Why is Mary saying go to Jesus? Oh, because Jesus works miracles. No, we've never seen him work. We don't know he works miracles. Go to Jesus because he can afford it. He's the one with the money. You run out of wine, tell Jesus. It's Friday, isn't it? If you think about it, no one was looking for a miracle. No one was looking for miracle wine. He's never done it before. Why are you bringing this problem, this economic problem, to Christ? Because clearly, he is the one that has the means to deal with the economic crisis.
All right, so if you run out of wine at the wedding, who are you going to call? The Ghostbusters, sorry. Who are you going to call? And he argues that you're going to call somebody who has the means to fix it. First of all, if you read the story in the book of John, you will discover at no point do they go to Mary and then Mary says go to Jesus. Mary just observes that they're out of wine and goes to Jesus. I don't know why, okay? But the narrative is not that they went to Mary and then Mary went to Jesus. Mary just went to Jesus. And the question of who do you go to when you run out of wine, and he argues you go for the people who have the means. No, you go to the servants. I mean, That's who you're going to. You're not going to the people with the money. You're going to the people who work for you, and you're saying, fix this problem. You know, even the master of the house later on is surprised by how good the second, you know, product of wine, second wine serving, second wine product is superior to the first. So I don't know. You know, he's also arguing that that she wouldn't have known that Jesus could work miracles. I don't know. I mean, that's an assumption. We don't hear a lot in the Bible about what Jesus did as a young boy. There are some apocryphal texts that claim Jesus worked miracles. But Mary knew who Jesus was. And, you know, it's like that song, Mary, Did You Know? Well, she knew a bit of it, you know, not all of it, but she did know a bit of it. So I don't know why Mary asked in that story. I think it's a leap to make the point that Jesus was asked to fix the wine problem because he had the money to fix the wine problem, and that there's no way it could have been Mary, you know, looking for a miraculous solution. We just don't know. It's the first miracle that Jesus did, according to the book of John, but we don't know what happened on a very personal level between Mary and her son and what she observed him doing. So, yeah, again, this is one of those things. I mean, it could be right that may have been what was going on, but it is a huge assumption to make that kind of leap.
Jesus recruits a team of 12 full-grown men with families who are themselves entrepreneurs and convinces them to leave the business and follow him while they still have responsibility for their families. Now, poor people can't do that. A poor man cannot walk up to you running your business and say, brother, leave the business and come and follow me. But there's a reason why these guys are like, you know what? Yeah, let's leave the business and follow Jesus. Because you see, it became very clear to them that following Jesus would not produce any lack or would not in any way abdicate their responsibility to look after their families.
All right, so first of all, Jesus' disciples were not all entrepreneurs. Some of them were tax collectors. A bulk of them were fishermen, fishing in their father's business. In fact, you hear them, there's references to James and John washing their father's nets. This does not make them entrepreneurs. This makes them people who weren't able to complete a formal education and had to go work in their father's business. Some of them may have chosen that. That was completely possible. They may have just loved fishing and chose to do that. But these are definitely blue-collar workers. It's not the same like as an entrepreneur today. It's a very different economic system. They were heavily taxed. They lived and died by what they were able to produce fishing. And in fact, when Jesus comes on the scene, business, if they were entrepreneurs, isn't that great. They're not doing a very good job. There's a couple of stories in which they're fishing and are catching no fish, and Jesus has to instruct them how to fish, and they do better. So these are not like, general contractors with huge budgets out driving their big F-150 trucks and then are like, yeah, we got enough money to follow Jesus. The other thing, too, that he's saying here really, in my opinion, does so much damage to the idea of the power of faith, because he's basically arguing that the disciples would have never followed Jesus had they not known that their needs and the needs of their family could be met. That's just not true. Like, they followed Jesus because something spiritual happened within them, and they recognized him as being different and unique and someone that they needed to follow. They were compelled. They were drawn to Jesus to follow him. And it wasn't just the 12. A lot of people followed Jesus. A lot of people who didn't have money, like the feeding of the 5,000. These people didn't have the money to feed themselves, but they've been following Jesus and they're hungry. So also, this was a time of desperation. Like, everyone was so poor in Israel except for the religious elites and the tax collectors and the Roman politicians. Everyone was really poor. And so it's like, leaving and following someone and relying on one another to have your needs met was very common in that time period. Also, communal living and taking care of the stranger, those were still big values. So this is not the same thing. This is not the same thing as what he's framing it as at all. These guys, they trusted Jesus because they saw something in Jesus that was different. This was an act of faith. Now, they had money, all right? Like, there was a treasury. He does tell them when you go out, don't take your purse with you. So obviously they had, they had currency. It wasn't like they didn't have currency. They did, but that doesn't mean that they had wealth. They had jobs, they had currency, they were able to take care of their families, they were able to do the things they needed to do, but it doesn't mean that they were wealthy people in first century Israel were really primarily the religious elites, the tax collectors, the Roman politicians, or thieves. Like those were the people who had the most money. It wasn't blue collar fishermen out on the sea catching fish, or in their case, not catching fish. So this is another really poor argument that he's trying to use here.
Jesus wore designer clothes. Oh, yes, he did. You see, when he was crucified, there were two garments that he had, the inner garment, the outer garment. They took his clothes, Roman soldiers, by the way, employees of the Roman Empire, took one of his garments and cut it into 4 pieces so they could each take a cloth. Does that sound like a rag? Does that sound like a poor man's rag, that I just want a piece of his cloth? Sounds like expensive cloth, right? Then his coat, they said, we cannot cut it because it is a special garment woven from the top without seam. If you look at the history of that, those garments took about 5 years to make. Those garments were royal garments. Those garments were reserved for kings. So they said, we cannot cut that. We are going to gamble over it. So Roman soldiers are gambling over a garment, and they're also taking pieces of cloth. So your vision of Jesus now somewhat changes when you realize that this guy moved with an entourage of 12 successful entrepreneurs into a town dressed like a king and walked in and arrested the attention of thousands of people. And if they got hungry, he fed them by a miracle. That's the Jesus of the New Testament.
Okay, so it is true that Jesus had a seamless garment. And he is right that they cast lots and they divided the inner garment, and then the outer garment, they didn't want to cut it up because it was too costly. He is right that a seamless garment in this time period took longer to make, took hours to make, and it would have been sold at a higher cost than garments that had seams. What he's wrong about is that these were not uncommon garments, and they definitely weren't reserved for royalty only. You have to remember, the only king is Herod. He's kind of a puppet king. And then there's Caesar, who wouldn't be wearing Jewish garments, most likely. So it's not like there's like this huge market for kings and someone's out there sewing these seamless garments for them. Seamless garments were more expensive, and they would not have been, worn by as many people, or as many people wouldn't have had a large collection of them. However, it's very possible this was just a gift. It's very possible that Jesus just had a thing for nice clothes. I'm vain that way. I like to have nice clothes and nice hats, especially. As you can see a lot of times in my videos, I like to have lots of hats, and I like nice hats. But I'm not wealthy. Some people might, even the hat I'm wearing tonight, this is a hat that costs more than most hats do. That doesn't make me wealthy. I can't remember if this was a gift or if I got it on sale or if I paid full price for it. I can't remember now. But I acquired it somehow, and Jesus acquired a nice garment somehow. It does not mean that he was wealthy by any stretch.
2 Corinthians 8, verse 9, it says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, how that, although he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, so that we through his poverty might become rich.
Amen.
And I know that at a theological level,
yes,
this is some reference to the incarnation.
Yes. Of
Stay the there. Riches he gave up in heaven.
Yes.
But when you look at his life,
then he's got a butt.
The fact that he was born into a royal family,
no,
and a massive deposit of wealth was made into his mission
We
at
don't
an
know.
early stage, with custodians and trustees, Mary and Joseph, looking after it for his ministry, to where he could afford to ask 12 entrepreneurs to retire and serve him,
Oh, boy.
and carry enough money in a bag to feed thousands if necessary, and wear clothes that you wouldn't even cut. You'd have to gamble over it to see who could get it. He was rich, my friends.
It's a reach.
And for our sakes,
It's a reach.
he became poor.
He did become poor for our
And we,
sakes.
through his poverty,
Yes.
can become rich.
Yes. But not with money.
Now, you see,
Rich in other ways.
I really am a follower of Jesus and really want to be more like him.
Amen.
Because, see, the Bible assumes all the way through that good people
Nope. Now, if it's
are
gonna say
in a
they're rich.
position to help
Okay.
the poorest and most vulnerable people,
Good people
at a
do help.
practical level.
On a practical level, yes. Yes. I can agree with that. Good people help people on a practical level. Good people are not good because they have more means to help on a practical level than someone else. Nor does the person who helps, nor are they good and the people that are being helped not good. Think about that, because if the argument is that good people are the ones that have the means, then that means the people who don't have the means and that need the help are not good people, and that does not fit within the larger context of Jesus's teachings, especially about the poor and how we're supposed to treat them. So all of that to say, our preacher here gives us a lot of things to think about, and a lot of things he is right about, and a lot of things people don't think about, like the wise men, and the wealth that Jesus may have had from that gift. People don't think about those kinds of things. People don't imagine the fact that Jesus might have had a treasury, and he did. I mean, he had a treasurer. There was a bag. They had means. He told them not to take the purse when they went out. And they had money to give to the poor. They must have been known for it, because there were times in which people were like, well, Jesus could have taken that money and given it to the poor. So there was some sort of precedent there that had been was already in practice by Jesus and his followers. I think the point, though, that I want to make is that it's not about the wealth. Jesus' teachings were never about the wealth. And that's why I think if you look hard enough, you can find arguments that Jesus was rich. You can find arguments that Jesus was poor. Because at the end of the day, it didn't matter to Jesus. Jesus wasn't here to be poor or to be rich. He was here to teach us what God really looked like, to show us in the flesh, in the incarnation, who God really was, and to embody everything that God had promised humanity through Israel. Jesus becomes, in some sense, he becomes that the fulfillment of all of Israel's promises to the world. And his teachings were not about getting wealth per se. There are teachings about being wise with wealth. There are teachings about being wise with your means. There are teachings about making sure that wealth doesn't have your heart. There are times Jesus says, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. There are other times where he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God's what is God's, making this, still giving the person their own private autonomy on how they spend their money and how they should spend their money. Because it was a heart condition. That's what Jesus was concerned about. He was concerned about our posture towards wealth, how we earned it. Did we earn it honestly? Did we earn it righteously? And did we share it righteously? Did we steward it righteously? At the end of the day, that's what's important to Jesus. So my final word on it is this. Go out, work, do well in life, enjoy what you make, enjoy what you earn. Enjoy it, whether it's a lot or whether it's a little. Be satisfied with it, and seek God continually on how you can be a more righteous steward of what he blesses you with. If you're one of those individuals who, through your own means or through some stroke of fortune, have been blessed to have wealth, then pray and seek God on how you can be good stewards of that. But don't think for 1 second that makes you good or better than anyone else, because it just doesn't. Now, if you do have it, should you share it? Yes. And could that be one of your motivators for making money? Absolutely. It is mine. I want to have money so that I can help others. In fact, right before I got on this podcast, I was able to do that for a friend, a very small amount, and they needed it and I had it, and I was able to help them out for the time being. That's what I like to do. That's why I like to earn money and to also have it for my family. So all in all, it's a moral issue, it's a heart issue. Being rich does not equal being good, does not equal being blessed, and being poor does not mean that you're bad or you're sinful. It just is what it is. And gratitude is the way to navigate these waters and not be jealous and not find yourself in a place of insecurity or comparing yourself to other people and to their success. Enjoy the life enjoy the life that God has given you. If that means you work hard and you don't travel, but you're able to make your means and you're able to feed your family, so be it. If it means you're able to travel the world and do all these fantastic things, do it with the right mind and with the right heart and with the right motives. And in the end, that is what the Lord is looking for. And he is looking. Matthew 24, the final judgment, is not about who prayed the prayer of salvation or who got baptized or whatever. In Matthew 24, the separation of the sheep and the goats is over. Did they share a cup of water? Did they visit the sick? Did they feed the hungry? Did they visit those in prison? Those are the things that matter at the end of the day, not how much money is in your bank account. Until next time, this is Intersections. If you like this podcast or this video, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. I would really appreciate it.